Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online program titled California, a Slave State. And thank you for joining us for this book club presentation this evening. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California. And it's of course, my pleasure to welcome you all and host the webinar. For those of you that might be new to the book club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with focus on the literature and the history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books, a scholarly journal called The Keepsake, called the Quarterly Newsletter, and a keepsake for our members. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest and the benefits are many. We simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit us online at bccbooks.org to join or to donate to the book club. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program again is titled California, a Slave State, and our presenter is Jean Pfaelzer. Jean Pfaelzer is professor of English and American Studies at University of Delaware. But actually, I think that title has changed. I think you're now the professor of English, Women and Gender and Asian Studies at the University of Delaware. She received her PhD from University College London, Cambridge University. Her MA and BA with honors in English are from University of California, Berkeley. But before her appointment at the University of Delaware, she taught at the University of California, San Diego, where she was president of the American Federation of Teachers, a union. She is the author of The Utopian Novel in America, 1886 to 1896, The Politics of Form, and Driven Out, The Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans, among other books. Now, in addition to her teaching and scholarship, she is a sought-after guest lecturer around the world. She has spoken at Smithsonian museums, the Library of Congress, the Woodrow Wilson Center, and as guest professor or visiting lecturer at universities all around the world. Now, just this year, Jean was awarded the United Chinese Americans Irish Shunru Chang Award for Humanity in honor of her outstanding work on the history of Chinese American immigrants and contribution to Chinese and AAPI communities. California, a Slave State, is her most recent book, and it was published in 2023 by Yale University Press. It is also the 2023 Heyday History Award winner. California owes its origins and sunny prosperity to slavery. Spanish invaders captured indigenous people to build the Catholic missions. Russian otter hunters shipped Alaska natives and launched a Pacific slave trade triangle to China. Plantation slaves were marched across the plains for the gold rush, and kidnapped Chinese girls were sold in caged brothels in early San Francisco. And of course, we've done programs where we've talked about the Indian boarding schools, supplying new farms and hotels with unfree child workers. Now, in California, a Slave State, Jean upends our understanding of slavery as a North-South struggle and reveals how the enslaved in California fought, fled, and resisted human bondage. Now, in terms of the logistics for this evening, we will have a lecture for about 40-ish minutes or so, and then we'll follow that with a Q&A session. Now, if you have questions or comments for our presenter or about the presentation itself, you can use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom. We will have time towards the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the chat and the Q&A. And now, I guess it's my great pleasure to hand over the controls and the microphone to our speaker, Jean Pfaelzer. Take it away, Jean.
Hi, and Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to the Book Club of California for welcoming me. I'm so excited to be in your new offices and to be launching this discussion from here. I'm very happy for it to be a discussion after my presentation, because I know that this is a vexed and difficult topic and new for all of us to chew on. So please feel free to put your questions into the chat, and Kevin will curate them in case any of them overlap, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. This may be new information to you. It was certainly new information to me. I was born in California. I went to Hamilton High School on Robertson Avenue in LA. I did my BA and MA at Berkeley, studying with incredible scholars in American studies and indeed in slavery studies. I took courses and worked with Kenneth Stamp, who wrote The Peculiar Institution. But throughout this education and my childhood and my political work, I never knew, I was never taught the history of slavery in California and the American West. I feel that I was well educated, but also unschooled. And tonight I want to share with you just some of what I discovered in writing California, a Slave State. This was a history that grew and grew and grew from historians, curators, political folks, county museums. There were images that were given to me during the fires in California 2.5 years ago. A woman from the Historical Society in Northern California, her husband was on the fire lines, and she said she really wanted me to have one of these images, and waited for him to come home, take care of the kids, and so she could cross the fire lines, open the museum, and get the photographs to me. So this is a collectively curated history and a story that, as people heard about it, made connections in their own minds, what they knew, what we all thought we knew, the story grew and grew. It begins with the Spanish invasion of California with Junipero Serra in 1867, and it ends with modern human trafficking. And that's the path we're going to follow tonight, looking for the particularities of how slavery evolved to alter and control the lives of Chinese people, Native American people, African Americans, Alaska Natives, and running throughout, I think we'll be seeing and keeping in mind a gendered story, a story that was different for women than for men. So with those complexities, let me start with the map. This is the famous Reynolds map, the political map of the United States. And this is the map that walked us into the Civil War. It's the map, it's the map that was published in 1858, and it's a colored map with gray areas, pink areas, and green areas. The pink areas are the areas that the makers of this map, the map that configured how we thought about free states and enslaved states. The free states are pink, and they're too small. The map is wrong, it's off, it's too horizontal. But the pink states are the free states. The gray states, and note that it includes Texas, where there were 200,000 enslaved African Americans picking cotton. And of most interest to us today, too, are the green colored areas. Those are the territories. And one of the divisive issues that took us into the Civil War were what was going to happen in these territories. Were they going to enter our country as free states or enslaved states? So the map is stretched, it's wrong. The free states are shrunk, in effect, to pressure people toward joining in the Civil War. But the biggest error for our discussion tonight is that they have California in pink as a free state. Other things that we need to keep in mind as we think tonight is that this map is only about the enslavement, the human bondage of African Americans. It does not include Native Americans, and it doesn't include Chinese migrants and Chinese Americans. What we'll do tonight is upend the North-South dichotomy, the North-South dualism of slavery in the United States. Another way that the map is wrong is it tells the story as a story without slave revolts, the story without endurance, a story without resistance. I've been very interested, obviously anxious, but as the reviews come in on California, a slave state, the reviewers are really focusing on the idea of slavery in California. They are not picking up on the parallel story, the parallel narrative in this book of slave resistance, slave revolts, fugitivity, running away, the colored conventions that were all demanding freedom for enslaved people in California. There was no place in California where slavery occurred, where it wasn't fought, and in some ways, most ways, fought successfully. So my title, California, a Slave State, is both a title, but it's also an argument. This is the story, the untold history of human bondage in California. As you all know, gold was discovered in California in 1848, and it was discovered next to the ranch and on the land of John Sutter. And we think about Sutter, well, one, we think about all the hospitals and clinics named after Sutter, Sutter Healthcare. But before that, what we don't think about is that John Sutter was a slaveholder of 5,000 to 6,000 Native American men. Sutter discovers that there's more money in owning and renting out to other ranchers, enslaved Native Americans, than there was in gold mining. I didn't know that. Members of my family were well cared for at Sutter hospitals and Sutter clinics, but we didn't know the downside of that story. What I also didn't know is that plantation owners, with the discovery of gold, brought over 1,500 enslaved Black people to California. Like the enslaved miner that we see in this picture, what this slide doesn't capture is hovering over him is a white man in a wagon controlling the labor that this man is doing. He was not gold mining for himself. He wasn't working for his own profit. He had been marched across the plains, often enslaved Black people were brought out with skills that they had been forced to learn on the plantation. Many of them learned management of cattle, management of oxen. Clearly, they were not trained miners, and they were brought out to do the dirty work of mining along riverbeds, up to their waist in water and mud, sorting through for gold dust, and the profit was to go to their owners. This is the story of the man that we're looking at. Right away, people from all over the world, from China, from Chile, from Argentina, from the East Coast, veterans from the war against Mexico, hear that there is gold in California. The veterans from the war against Mexico, that brutal invasion when the United States wins, and in its victory, the United States takes the top third of Mexico. Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, parts of Utah, all were Mexico, and suddenly now they belong to the United States. And veterans from that brutal war are marching home, marching back to New England, marching back to the East Coast in 1848 as the treaty is signed, and they hear that gold is discovered in California, and they turn around and march west to California. There were separate wagon trains that advertised as slave wagon trains so that enslavers were welcome to travel with them in the wagons to bring enslaved people to California. Most of the enslaved African Americans who were brought out to California for the gold rush are men, but there were women on the trains as well in the wagons. They worked as seamstresses, they worked as midwives on the train, delivering the babies of white, quote, pioneers. The United States is receiving tons of money from gold in California. And the question is, how quickly can they turn California into a state? The tradition, the law at the time, is that states were to be admitted in pairs, one free state for every slave state. And there was no state to pair with California. But at the time, within the first year of the gold rush, California is sending $1.5 billion worth of gold to the East Coast. In my view, there was no way that California wasn't going to be admitted to the United States. The deal was that California was going to be admitted as a free state. It didn't want to be admitted as a free state. Remember that convention, 1849, meets up in Monterey in California to write the Constitution that's going to bring California into the Union. There were 44 white men and 8 Latina men, very wealthy ranchers who already had peons working for them. And many of the men at the Constitutional Convention, including our first senator, were slaveholders. And they had to find a workaround to get California admitted to the Union and yet to keep their traditions of slavery alive. What happens is they write a constitution that says slavery will never be tolerated in the United States. Tolerate is not a legal standard. There is no legal standard that turns something untolerated into against the law. So our first constitution says slavery will never be tolerated in California, and they didn't mean it. Remember the Missouri Compromise, that thing we all learned in high school. Some of us had to memorize for the SATs. The Missouri Compromise was a trifecta. This was the deal that creates our state, creates California. The first is that Utah and Nevada could choose whether they wanted to come into California, come into the United States as free or enslaved. California would come into the United States as a free state. And most dangerous and most vicious was the third part of this trifecta of the Missouri Compromise, is that Congress agreed to, and indeed did pass, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 said that any Black person in the North could be targeted, named a runaway, seized, and sold. It is one of the most dangerous and vicious pieces of American legislation. So that is how we came into the United States as a slave state. Our vocabulary is rich in terms of what makes a human being an enslaved person. It can happen by capture, kidnap, sale, assault, rent, as Sutter did. It involves the forced transport of people. People are rarely enslaved at home. It's too easy to find support, too easy to run away. So I'm including forced mobility in my definition of slavery. It happened to women and it happened to men. Native Americans were forcibly indentured and legally indentured in California, and African Americans were transported across the plains or through the jungles of Panama. It was actually faster and cheaper to sail down the East Coast to the Chagres River and paddle through the jungles of Panama, through the jungles, down the other side, and wait for a ship where thousands of people were gathered, waiting to travel up to California for the gold rush. Some ships did not allow Black people on it. Many ships, ships, charged an extra fee for transporting an African American to California for the gold rush. And then the other group of people we'll talk about today were Chinese girls. Chinese girls were kidnapped from the port cities of Guangdong, of Canton, and forced to California to work as enslaved prostitutes, initially here in San Francisco on Jackson Street, and then shipped out to service gold miners who were working in the foothills in the gold-rich California. So enslaved people are unpaid for the labor that they do. In California, they weren't necessarily, in fact, rarely, as in the plantation South, the child of an enslaved African woman was also by definition enslaved. That was not built into the legal structure of California. But the indenture and capture and control and ownership of people needs to be understood in this term that's been around us now of settler colonialism, where you conquer the land by settling it, not just by fighting for it. We need to hold in mind that the era of the birth of California is happening, as historian Ben Madley has so brilliantly written. It's happening at the same time as the California genocide, where the US military sweeps into California and to take over Native American tribal lands for settlement, for ranches, for orange groves, for gold. So this is a complex and long and layered history that endures today. Today, California has the most victims of human trafficking in the nation. The South always planned to extend plantation slavery up to the Pacific coast, up to the American West. Tobacco and cotton are nasty for soil. The Southern soil was dried out, it was exploited, and they needed new soil for tobacco and cotton, and they always planned to move plantation slavery to the West. In fact, before gold was even discovered, plantation owners had brought enslaved African Americans to California to work in the fields. With the gold rush, the numbers I have are that about 1,500 African Americans were marched across the plains to work in mines. Some of them, we now know who these individual men and women were. For example, we have a biography by an African man, enslaved African man named Alvin Coffey. Alvin Coffey was owned by 3 different owners to work for them in California. He was brought out enslaved from California. One of his owners discovers there's more money in renting Alvin Coffey out than there is in forcing him to work in the mines. And they let Coffey work for himself in whatever free time he had. In that free time, he's able to accumulate several $1,000s in gold dust, and his owners take it for him. What they're holding over Alvin Coffey is his wife, Mahala. They are keeping Mahala back in Missouri, not free. Also, Alvin Coffey, like many enslaved African Americans brought to California, was never, ever told he was in a free state. Alvin Coffey could have fled in the forests, along the rivers, but instead he was forced back to California, where they seized the money he earns. He's sold, he comes back to California, he earns more money, and in 3 trips to California, he finally earns enough money to buy Mahala. He brings her back to California, they mine together, and he starts one of the first schools for African American and Native American kids in California. African Americans resisted the enslavement that was imposed on their brethren. Sometimes people doubt my story. This is an ad that was in the San Francisco Express in the early 1850s. It's the kind of ad we think we would have found, say, in a New Orleans paper or in an Alabama newspaper for something, an advertisement, say, along the Mississippi. And the ad is from the San Francisco Express on June 17th, Negro for sale. And B.J. Lathrop is announcing the sale at public auction of a, quote, Negro man, he having agreed to said sale in preference to being sent home, to being sent back to California. The evidence for slavery in California is all over the place. It's in the newspapers, it's in these advertisements that I did not expect to stumble on in California. African Americans resisted. They fought back. What happens in California is that not only enslaved blacks are coming to California, free blacks are coming to California at the same time. Free blacks from the North, from Connecticut, from New York, from Mississippi, from Massachusetts, from Delaware, are coming to California for the same reason that everybody else from all over the world is coming to California. In fact, at first, Frederick Douglass does not want free blacks to go to California. He says, you can't leave now. We are in the peak of abolition. We are facing the chance of freedom. You folks cannot leave. And they say to Douglass, we're going. We are out of here. We are entitled for the first time in our lives at the same wealth as other people are having and enjoying. Douglass says, some of you, the leaders, need to travel with me for the summer and learn how to be organizers for abolition. And they do, and at the end of that summer of 1850 and then 1851, he sends and free blacks to California with his blessing. And there's incredible correspondence for any of you, and people in this book club would, of course, be interested. There's correspondence to Douglass, to the North Star newspaper, to the Frederick Douglass paper, documenting the lives of free blacks in California. but free Blacks in California did not expect to find enslaved Blacks in California. And enslaved Blacks did not expect to find a community of free Blacks who were going to rescue them, seize them from slavery, and take their right to be free people in now what is on the books as a free state, take their cases to court. What's also in the California Constitution is a ban on Blacks and Native Americans testifying in court. And the legislature would then quickly add, and no Chinese people could testify in court either. In California, there were 3 colored conventions before the Civil War. I didn't know until the work of scholar Gabrielle Foreman that there were colored conventions, meetings of thousands upon thousands of mostly free Blacks, sometimes enslaved Blacks, across the United States. And Black people would gather to figure out how to demand abolition, demand their right to survive, demand housing, demand the right to vote. There were 3 colored conventions in California before the Civil War, 2 in Sacramento, 1 in San Francisco. The one in Sacramento is deliberately at the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Sacramento, right by the state capitol, right in the face of the Capitol. As I read through the minutes of the colored conventions in California, I was looking for the word freedom, looking for the word abolition. And instead, what I found is what's on this petition. They're looking for the right to give evidence against white persons. And it took me a while to understand that the right to testify was a demand for freedom. If you could not enter into evidence the state constitution, or your manumission papers, or your freedom papers, or the history of your enslavement, you wouldn't be free. It took me a while to get it, that the demand for the right to testify is a demand for freedom. Women are not supposed to cry at work, but I have to tell you that when I was in the archives in Sacramento and I came upon 8,000 petitions like this that were started at the Colored Convention and circulated throughout California, and just touching these petitions and wondering, how did you get 8,000 petitions before the Civil War? I mean, now we sign petitions all the time. It comes into our email. We either sign them or we erase them. We try and check it out. But for people, when there was no railroad in California, there were some steam riverboats in California. There were no macadam roads in California. I am awed by how these 3 colored conventions generated 8,000 petitions like the one you're seeing. And the truth is, when I was in the archives and touching these petitions, I cried. And if there were 8,000 petitions, and I haven't been able to match name by name, if there were 8,000 petitions, that meant that Black people were able to get a lot of white people to sign the petition for their right to testify. So the resistance to slavery, the demands for freedom, were formidable in California. There were other kinds of resistance. Surviving was an important kind of resistance. A colleague of mine, when I taught at UC San Diego, African-American poet Shirley Ann Williams, said to me, you know, you white people don't credit survival enough. And I've thought about that for a long time. And in doing this book now, I've really, at the most feelingful level, tried to understand that survival is also a kind of resistance. Enslaved people stole food. They learned to recognize the bark of hound dogs that would chase them when they ran away, dogs that were brought out from the East Coast. Native American kids who were seized to go into the Indian boarding schools, these children were hidden. There are stories of moms hiding their children in bushes or in an empty redwood log, hiding them from the recruiters who've come to take their kids to the Indian boarding school. As in the South, enslaved people shared information, they shared food. Native Americans in California didn't have the horse. Learning and teaching each other to ride the horse was a form of resistance. And we have to remember in San Francisco, Charlotte Brown, before the Civil War, rides the trams in San Francisco. African-American 22-year-old girl rides the trams in San Francisco. 3 times she's thrown off the trams, and she rides them again, knowing she's going to be thrown off. The first time she's thrown off, she sues with her dad, and she wins a nickel, the cost of the ticket, and they agree that isn't enough. Charlotte Brown gets herself thrown off the trams again, and this time she not only wins a suit for several $100s, she opens up California Transportation and San Francisco Trams, the omnibus tram company, to Black people. 100 years ahead of Rosa Parks, Charlotte Brown opens public transportation for African Americans. Right now, there are 2 reparations commissions in California, one in San Francisco and one the California Reparations Commissions, and others are springing up in Sacramento and LA. I think as we head into this discussion, it's important to remember that slavery costs. It cost Charlotte Brown. It cost the wounds, the injuries, and the costs of the lawsuit. It cost losing jobs, jobs that you weren't able to hold, houses that you weren't able to rent, redlining across the state, not being able to send your kids to school. Slavery was not inexpensive. The first senator from California was a guy named William Gwin, a name I didn't learn. He's the first senator from California, and he was a plantation owner from Mississippi. William Gwin comes to California through Oregon. Oregon is still a territory. And what Gwin does in Oregon is get Blacks banned from Oregon. Blacks were banned from Oregon. If you didn't leave Oregon before the Civil War, and if you were a Black person, you were subject to 6 months in jail and being whipped 60 times. Incredible pressure towards ethnic cleansing in Oregon. Gwin was one of the leaders of that movement. He comes to California and he becomes our first senator. William Gwin brings with him a very elderly Black couple. And their last name is the Sires. He brings them to California saying they're too old to work on my plantation, they're too old to pick cotton, and he brings them out to work as his house slaves in San Francisco. He buys a big house in San Francisco, and he brings out the Sires, George and Mrs. Sires. Interestingly, we don't know her first name. He doesn't get reelected. He's gone bust in the gold fields, and he decides to go back to the South. But he figures the Sires are worthless. They're too old to be useful to him, and they're certainly too old to pick cotton. And he dumps them in a Black neighborhood in San Francisco. They're isolated, they're illiterate, they didn't know they were in a free state, and hence they never asked for wages. So after working them here for 2 years, and Gwyn decides he's a loser, he's going back, and he's not going to pay to transport these elderly people across the plains. In 1857, he dumps them in a Black neighborhood, and free Blacks find the sires and they say, let's sue. And the sires sue William Gwyn, our senator, in Sire v. Gwyn, and they make demands for back wages. So this is a freedom lawsuit and it's a labor lawsuit. They claim in their lawsuit that Gwyn had, quote, appropriated their goods. By their goods, they mean their bodies and their services. And they calculate their labor at $50 a month. $50 a month for George and $55 a month for his unnamed wife. She was worth more because there were so few women in California to do domestic work. So their total is $2,282 that the Gwyns are demanding in back pay, or about $64,000 in current money. The couple, says the court, had an implied promise to pay them. They claimed that the Gwyns had an implied promise to pay them for their labor and owed them for 2 years of slave labor. But this all-white jury concedes that slavery was outlawed in the state, but could they retain, as white people in a free state, could they force men and women to work without wages? Gwyn concedes that no, he'd never paid the sires, but he'd given them food and shelter. He said, like a parent. He didn't pay the sires for tasks they perform out of love or duty, or like relatives who anticipate an inheritance. But of course, the sires were neither Gwyn's heirs nor his children. The jury said that the sires should have known that they were living in a free state, and if they wanted, they could have left Gwyn to work for someone else. They worked for him, said the court, voluntarily. And in fact, if he ends up with them back in the South, their, quote, former relation would revive. In other words, if they went from California back to the state, they would be enslaved again. There are a series of court cases like this. And as we think today about the importance of the courts decide over and over and over again that slavers held the right to own enslaved people in California. Over and over again, the courts ignore the court issue that enslaved people are in fact living in a free state and are free laborers. The first slaves in California, the first enslaved people, come with the missions. This photograph is obviously taken after there was the camera, which was long after the end of the mission system. But this is what a mission looked like in California. It didn't look like the Taco Bell image that we have now. In 1769, Junipero Serra invades California with 100 Spanish soldiers and 8 fanatical priests. Junipero Serra is carrying a bull from the Pope, permission from the Pope, and an order from the Spanish Emperor to conquer and convert thousands of California Native Americans, seize the lands along the coast, and build a chain of what would turn into 21 plantations or missions. But the goal wasn't just to convert Native Americans to Catholicism. The goal was to have these huge ranches that would feed the Spanish Empire, and in particular to feed people, enslaved people and the Spanish soldiers at the silver mines in Mexico and Peru. So as we think about slavery in California, we need to think globally, that the mission system, the fantasy, was that there would be orchards and vineyards and wine and fruits and vegetables that would be shipped down to Mexico and down to Peru to support the slavery at the silver mines in Mexico and Peru. This is not the fourth grade mission project that our kids were taught in the fourth grade, and that some of us were taught in the fourth grade. I had to grind up acorns in my fourth grade class or my elementary school class, and they tasted horrible. And of course, we weren't taught all of the meal preparation and cooking preparation that happens to acorns to make acorn soup and acorn mush edible and in fact delicious. The first slave revolt in California happens at the first instance of slavery in California in 1875, within a few years of the San Diego mission, Mission San Diego de Acala in San Diego, where hundreds of Kumeyaay Indians were seized and trapped and held. There's a slave revolt. All of the clans of the Kumeyaay tribe that surrounded the mission San Diego prepare over a series of months. They sharpen their arrows, they make new bows, and they sweep into Mission San Diego. They burn Mission San Diego to the ground. They slaughter the head commandant, the head priest, and they free all of the tribesmen, the Kumeyaay tribesmen, never to return. I didn't learn this. I taught at UCSD. I went to quinceañeras. I went to weddings at the new Mission San Diego, and I never knew that the earlier one had been burned to the ground in a slave revolt. I never learned that there were coordinated slave revolts at Mission Santa Barbara, La Purísima, Mission Santa Ynez, where the priests were held and the Native Americans captured at these missions fled into the Tule marshes to be welcomed and received by the Yupik tribe, who took them deeper into the marshes where they could find their freedom. They are, of course, chased. Many were defeated and brought back, but many survived and escaped and contributed to the end of the mission system. This is what we think about today, the sort of Taco Bell architecture, the Technicolor mission system. But there was another story of the missions. The first slaves imported into California are brought by the Russians. If you've got the Spanish coming from the south, you've got the Russians coming from the north, and they stop and build Fort Ross up in Sonoma County. I view Fort Ross as a slave plantation where Alaskan natives who have been seized by the Russians, who crossed the Aleutian Islands to capture the sea otter. The Russians are on a quest, like other people, for a fast route to China. They don't find a route to China, but they discover the little sea otter. And the only people who can capture the little furry sea otter are Alaskan natives, as you see in the bottom of this image. Later explorers, American explorers, would always travel with the camera. The Russians traveled with watercolorists. This is a watercolor by Louis Chorice, and who was trained in France. And as the Russians move across the Aleutian Islands, capturing the sea otter for a pelt that would sell in China for, at the time, $3,500. If you picture images of Chinese Mandarin, the Chinese Mandarins in China, with fur around their collar, fur around their cuffs, muffs, fur around the hem of their robes. That's otter fur. And otter fur is the silkiest fur in the world. And the Russians, who were skilled at sable and mink hunting, knew that the discovery of the sea otter would save the Russian Empire. So what we have is a Pacific slave triangle: Alaska, California, Canton, Alaska, California, Canton, and what the Alaskan natives captured and deposited in coves along the California coast. What they are producing for the Russian Empire are these furry pelts that are sold in China. As the Russians encounter the Spanish, they realize they're stopped and they don't go further south than Bodega Bay, where they build Fort Ross. As they decimate the otters along the coast, and they know they can't go below Fort Ross or into San Francisco Bay because it's controlled by the Spanish, the Russians deposit Alaska natives on the Farallon Islands. Alaska natives were forced to live on the Farallon Islands and hunt the sea otter, this little furry, silky sea rat, and those pelts were taken to China. They were abandoned on the Farallon Islands for up to 6 months, and even as skilled kayakers, they couldn't escape because the Farallons, then as now, are surrounded by sharks. California's first law, very first law that's passed even as California is becoming a state, before we are legally a state, California passes the Act for the Government and Protection of the Indian. This is the most brutal and painful image that we'll look at today. This is a picture of a captured Native American girl, not wearing Native American clothes, who's been kidnapped to serve as a wet nurse for a white baby. It's a studio photograph. Who would take this kidnapped young girl? What's happening to her baby? Where's her breast milk going? Who is feeding her own baby as she's kidnapped to serve as a nanny to this little girl, and then posed in this cruel parody of a Madonna child pose of nursing this white baby? The 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of the Indian legalized the kidnap, the rape, and the forced indenture of Native Americans. Boys until they were 25 years old, and girls until they were 35 years old. This is a painful and difficult image to watch and to interpret. If you want to think about it more, it's included in the book, but I feel it's important to frame it before we look at it. This is another very difficult image, and it's one of the images that prompted me to write this book. Chinese men chose to come to California. They chose to come to California like men from all over the world, for the adventure, for the money, to get away from the war, the poverty, the Taiping revolt in China that would come later. And so Chinese men chose to come to California always as free people. They were sometimes under contract. They borrowed money to come here, as my ancestors did, my grandpa did, to come to California, to come to the United States. But they came freely. Chinese men chose to come here. Chinese women had a different history. They were kidnapped from the port cities of Guangdong and shipped often in padded crates, and they were sold blocks from where I am right now. They were sold blocks from slave blocks on the docks in San Francisco. And those who didn't sell or weren't already pre-ordered were sold from a room in Chinatown called the Queen's Room. There was a prostitution tong called the Hip Yi Tong that contracted brokers to seize the girls. The Hip Yi Tong was in a corrupt deal with the San Francisco police to look the other way or to help them do this and to sell Chinese girls. This is an image taken on Jackson Street, which flows into Grant Avenue. Jackson Street was lined with caged brothels, and this little girl, I have stared at her and stared at her. She looks to me about 12 or 14. She was locked in a cage. There was a curtain that would be drawn across the cage. The madam was often the wife of a Chinese merchant, and she would be forced to solicit herself to all the men who passed by on Jackson Street. She serviced up to 20 men a day. I truly, as a woman, cannot imagine the rape 20 times a day of being sold. The men would hand her the money. She would record that money on that little scroll and hand the money over to the madam, who would open the curtain, and she would be forced to solicit another man. Some of these girls had signed contracts for 4 years, but with disease, with syphilis, with the brutality of forced sex, many of them didn't live out the 4 years, or many of them had no way, because they couldn't testify, to enforce these sham contracts. But those who fled ended up across rural California, particularly Northern California, and they're the people who start the early Chinatowns, the women who start the early Chinatowns of rural California, often in relationship with former Chinese railroad workers. But I have stared at this little girl, and I felt compelled to find her story, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this book. We also see in the history of California the birth of convict labor, that convicts were seized to work on prison brigs that were floating in the bay. Sailors and captains from who brought men out to the gold rush abandoned their ships in San Francisco Bay. There were 400 boats bobbing around San Francisco Bay, such as this one. This was the LaGrange. It was dragged up to Sacramento, and it becomes a prison brig. And the prisoners, the convicts, are hauled all over the Delta and San Francisco to build sewage systems, to build the roads, to build mansions, and ultimately to build San Quentin Prison. The state legislature finally calls a halt to it and says to the contractor, you cannot rent out these prisoners anymore, although legally you own them, and you have to build San Quentin Prison in Marin County. And what happens in San Quentin is that the convict labor, instead of working the streets, working the bay, is working in factories in the basement of San Quentin Prison. They are weaving jute bags. Jute was like burlap. They are weaving jute bags to hold the wheat of California agriculture. There were 1,000 looms, steam looms, where the prisoners had to weave the jute bags to be sold to California farmers. They worked a 12-hour shift. If they moved, if they spoke, they were tortured. This is waterboarding. This is a form of torture that San Quentin copied from prisons. The new prisons in the East Coast, Auburn Prison, from Auburn Prison in New York, and they invent and transport waterboarding for any convict laborer who talked while he worked. The last form of 19th century slavery starts at the very end of the 19th century, the move into the 20th century at the Indian boarding schools. There were 12 Indian boarding schools in California. What happens is with the Indian Education Act, Indian kids, Native American kids are required to attend school, but there were no schools on the reservations, and they are taken into the Indian boarding schools. The biggest one was in Riverside, the Sherman Boarding School. They are copying a school you maybe have heard of called Carlisle in Pennsylvania, where the whole idea for the United States is formulated. This is photographs at Carlisle taken day one. It was the same procedure in California, day one. A child was stripped of his native clothing, both boys and girls, dressed in these sort of faux military scratchy wool costumes. They're never again allowed to speak their own language. Their hair is cut. They're not allowed to practice their own religion or eat their traditional foods. What happens to them is that they're entered into, at every school, native school in California, the outing program. When I read the word outing, I didn't get its full meaning. They were sent out to work. The Native American boarding schools were like slave employment agencies. The girls were sent into the hotels and the households to be forced domestic servant. This is a classroom in Riverside at the Sherman Indian Boarding School, where the girls are being taught to iron. And the little children were forced to provide for their own food. Here this is also from Sherman in Riverside. They're grubbing for potatoes in the field. This is a class photo from one of the entering classes at Sherman Boarding School in Riverside, California. Someone has written the children's numbers in a black crayon on the photograph. It's at Sherman. It's also now at the Library of Congress, where the destiny of these children is recorded, the tragic destiny of these children, little kids who were sent into hotels and into the orange groves. We can see the sorrow, the fear, the depression on this class photo from California. I want to end the story with what's happening now in California with human trafficking. And this is the other story that compelled me to write this book. I read about this in the Eureka Times Standard a few years ago, just as I was beginning to write this book. There was a 15-year-old girl, and this is in the last decade. She was wandering the streets of Hollywood. She gets picked up by two guys, and they drive her up to Lake County to work in their cannabis grow. They lock her into this crate, and they drill the two holes that you see. One was to torture her, to prod her with an electric cattle prod, and the other was to hose her down. They released her regularly, either to trim the buds of marijuana in late August and September, to trim the marijuana grows, and to sexually service themselves and the other field workers in the marijuana grows in Lake County. One day they drive her down to Sacramento to do the shopping. They lock her in a motel room while they go out and shop to supply the grow. She sees a telephone, she dials 911, and she frees herself. The men are in jail, and she is now free. This is a barcode. This is one of the ways that traffickers number and identify and control the girls that they have picked up, whether at truck stops or now more and more they seize girls for enforced prostitution and seduce them online. As I said, this is also a story of heroism and resistance. This is Edward Taylor. He's the first African-American to vote in California under the 15th Amendment that allowed African-Americans to vote. He was active in the Colored Convention. He was a formidable presence in the Bay Area. And this is his photograph taken after he votes for the first time under the 15th Amendment in California. This was an enslaved Egyptian girl who was trafficked here as a nanny, and her name is Shamima Hall. Shamima was identified, she was Egyptian. Why was this little girl being a nanny in a park to other children? Other parents at the park notice her day after day being a nanny to these other children. It turns out she was held captive, transported from Egypt. They turn her into social services. The parents, the quote parents, are arrested and jailed, and Shamima Hall sues them for her years of labor and her pain, and she wins over $60,000. She's put into foster care, and her foster parents take the money that she has won from this formidable lawsuit. Nonetheless, Shamima Hall becomes an activist against human trafficking, and she's written a biography. It's great for teachers. It's a young adult biography, and it's called Hidden Girl. And she has written herself into her freedom and has become an advocate in the human trafficking movement. And Shamima Hall is one of my heroes. This is a posed photograph, but it was in the garret, this shack garret built over a garage where she was forced to live for the year she was an enslaved nanny as a child down in Orange County. I'm going to end with this image of Yokeleen. Yokeleen was an enslaved prostitute, and she escapes from prostitution. She marries, and she writes this affidavit. She climbs the steps of the courthouse in Sonora, at the base of Sonora Pass, up in the foothills of the Sierras, and Yokeleen demands that they take her affidavit. And in this affidavit, she says, my husband Charlie, and Charlie, as we know, is a derogatory generic name for Chinese men. She says, my husband Charlie is in jail. This is a photograph taken of me in 1910 by this photographer. And 1910, let's remember, is the year they opened Angel Island Detention Center. My photograph has been taken in 1910. I have written this affidavit in Sonora, California, to claim and define that I am a free woman and that no man may ever own me again. Thank you. Thank you for listening tonight. And I'll stay to take your questions.
I'm back. I feel like you rushed there to the end. You can say a little more if you want to say a little bit more about this story.
Oh, there's so many stories, Kevin, and all of them. I just really wanted to, get through the chronology of the story so that to review and understand how capacious and diverse slavery was in California, and to share with our listeners the way it was enacted, and at the same time, how in each case, like with the Kumeyaay in San Diego, up to Yokeleen, who creates her own freedom, her own legal freedom, and protects her freedom through this affidavit, and things I didn't get a chance to talk about. There is the largest prison strike in American history. I think there were more people involved at San Quentin than at Attica for being forced to work in the jute factory. And there is a massive prison strike where the prisoners are then put in solitary. They're tortured with power hoses that are forced through the little food vents into the cells. They're brutally hosed down with this powerful water, and yet 1,000 convicts at San Quentin go out on strike. There is throughout the book the stories of how people fought for their freedom and fought against captivity and human bondage. I could talk for a long time. You know, one of the questions that people ask me is, how did I manage to write such a difficult and painful story? And I have to say that in this really vexed year, as history is being banished, as books are being banished in the schools, as we're seeing the rise of racism and the rise of the right, even in the just our own world of literature and books and history, and of course, in the end of voting rights, the attacks on women's reproductive rights. This has been a very painful few years for us. And yet, even so, I guess for me, writing this book wasn't an act of depression, but when I'm really bleak, I actually can turn to my own book for inspiration, to the history of California as a formidable and victorious history of freedom.
Yeah, there
A slave state, it's a freedom state.
great comments in the chat and the Q&A, which I'll share with you after. You don't need to look at them now. Share all with you about your passion. Clearly, you have a passion for this subject, and your compassion in telling these stories. It's very emotional, so I can only imagine like how you felt many different ways while writing this book and capturing these stories. I did put in the chat how to buy the book, a whole bunch of ways to buy it. I also gave them the link to your website so they can find out more about you, because you're a fascinating person, as well as I've come to know, getting to know you for this lecture. And I know everyone here appreciates you sharing this really important subject. And someone mentioned that just like me, there was so much that I didn't know about California as a slave state. We weren't taught any of this, at least in this way, and in the magnitude of enslaved people in California. So it's great that there is a book about it that covers all of this, the untold story of human bondage in California. I think you said that, and early on, and I think that perfectly encapsulates what this book is about, what people will come to know if they do get a copy of the book. There are a couple of questions that I will ask. It's about 6:15 now, I think. We're up 6:20 almost, so we're going to just do a couple of questions and then wrap up. I'll let you know that there is a recording of this, which we'll share with you and with everyone. It'll be on the book club's YouTube site, and you can get a copy of it if you came late or missed something. And then I will say this one early on question was, did the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois or C.L.R. James influence your thoughts, your perspectives on resistance to slavery? And if so, like how?
I think that probably I've been always influenced by W.E.B. Du Bois's writing, and in particular, amongst all of it, is the notion of double consciousness. And as I've talked about the struggles for freedom in California, what Du Bois talks about with double consciousness is that identity is formed not only by what we're told to think about ourselves, but what we know about ourselves to be true. That's the double consciousness. And I think that it helped me understand how, in the most troubling and disempowering or brutal situations, people managed to struggle and to give voice. To the degree I can, or I could, this book embeds the voices of the people who were enslaved. And what I'm working on now is an anthology of voices. And that would be almost in honor of Du Bois, yeah, so that the idea is that people retain, even as other people are telling you who you are, what your limits are, what your capacity is or isn't, through brutality, through literary stereotypes, images, inability to vote, and yet people were able to voice and deliver their own freedom, like the little girl, the teenager who dials 911, who still inside her knows she has the right to be free. So I think I was more than C.L.R. James, probably influenced by Du Bois with that notion. So I think I would very much say this book in some way is a study of double consciousness, of bondage and a self-identity, of the right and the capacity to be free.
But Kyle has a great question that I was thinking about early on too, and then I moved on to other notes on my page here. When did California move from the slavery is not tolerated language and that stand to really being actively in opposition to slavery that was happening?
Well, I think it happens gradually. It happens, slavery comes to an end for different groups in different ways. I mean, when I suggested that we have to think of California as a colony, as an empire state, first an empire of Spain, then attempted to be an empire of Russia. Putin still thinks he owns a corner. He thinks he owns the land on which Fort Ross is built. So there's the Spanish, there's the Russians. Then when Mexico defeats Spain and California becomes part of Mexico, and Mexico brings with it the ranchero system and the peon system, slavery comes to an end in different ways because Mexico ends the missions. But so enslaved people at the missions are now technically free, even though their homelands have been destroyed and their people have been destroyed. Most anthropologists agree that somewhere there were about, before invasion, before quote contact or conquest, there were 310,000 Native Americans in California. And the low numbers, and this number is not agreed upon, but the low numbers seem to be between 16,000 and 34,000 Native Americans endure into the mid to late 19th century. So from 310,000 to say 16 to 30,000 Native Americans survive the genocide in California and the enslavement in California and the reservation system and the Indian boarding schools. So slavery ends in some ways like the slave revolts at the mission. It ends when Mexico ends the mission system because they see the orchards, the land, the acreage, and they want it to turn into Mexican ranches. And yet they then adopt the peon system where there's no indenture, there's no end of being a peon. For the Chinese prostitutes who are so kidnapped and paid for in China, there was often a contract that limited their years of bondage to 4 years, but there was no way for these girls to enforce these contracts. And in fact, there are records and images of enslaved babies, of enslaved Chinese babies being brought to California and raised in the brothels. So it comes to an end with flight, with fugitivity, with and then a lot of it comes to an end with the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery. But as we know, there shall be no slavery in the United States, quote, except as punishment for a crime. So human bondage endures in convict labor today and now through human trafficking. So I think it's important, and I showed those pictures quite deliberately. So, and these are the pictures that are being shown to healthcare workers and police officers who have direct physical contact with people who have been captured and who are being sold, so that they can identify when in fact the situation involves the loss of freedom as well as the commission of a crime. So there's no end date, and
Right.
people who are involved in the issue of the carceral state are very aware of um, the affiliation of convict labor and unfree labor. And we know that at the detention centers at the border, people are being forced to work. Um, and we also know that the detention centers are now a source of human trafficking. People are being trafficked not only out of foster care, um, not only from the streets, not only from the web, but today, as we speak, they're being trafficked from the immigration detention centers, and that needs attention.
Well, I'm going to ask one more question and then we're going to wrap up. And because you mentioned early on a little bit about, and a couple times about reparations and some of the reparations movements that are happening. And I was wondering what you're doing. Are you getting involved in some of those conversations, advising on some of those committees, and what do you see happening there? Not what you want to have happen necessarily, or what you think is going to happen, but like kind of what's happening on the ground with the reparations movement.
I testified a few months ago before the final wrapper. There are too many R's. Before the final wrap up, I testified before the Reparations Commission of San Francisco. And I was brought in by the San Francisco head of the Human Rights Commission at the time, then Karen Clopton, to testify, who was aware of my book. And what is interesting, the demands of the Reparation Commission have done some amazing things because they really are tracing the economic progeny, the economic downstream um, of slavery. But the two reparations commissions in California that are most active, and others are springing up, are only focusing on African Americans. And I think Karen Clopton brought me in to talk about the breadth of people who are, for whom slavery, human bondage is their ancestry. And they are not, so Chinese people and Native American people are not being included yet in the demands for reparations. Nor is it, it isn't my role to only define, to define this. The other thing, though, is that the reports of the reparations commissions, the two of them, they're about 1,000 pages each, and they're phenomenal because they go through voting rights, housing rights, education rights, needs for health care, all of the ways people who have not been free have suffered. The assumption of the commissions was that the people that would benefit from this migrated from the South and that their ancestors were enslaved in the South. So the other reason I was brought in was to testify to this as a California phenomena. This isn't just a North-South phenomena where people in the Great Migration or World Wars or the Depression moved west to California. That we own this history, and it's a history that costs. The other thing that the California Reparations Commission has done is put a price on it. And it's an unpayable price. We acknowledge that in one way. It's $850 billion that the California Reparations Commission has attached. It is, I believe, the first time a dollar figure has been put on reparations. And there are many who say, that's the California budget for a year. We can afford this. If we can afford the budget over time, we can make it happen. What I believe is happening now is that the demands of the Reparation Commission are not being presented as a package. They're being taken apart, which may be the most realistic way to do this, and funded piecemeal to correct it and to deal with. But we're all very aware of the budget issues in California, and to add this on top is going to be an incredibly significant racial and political gesture toward freedom.
This is such an important subject, and this presentation was, eye-opening in so many ways, sobering in other ways. And I think there's a lot of great feedback, which I will share with you in the chat and the Q&A about this program this evening. So I want to just close by saying thank you, Jean. This was so amazing. You held our attention with all of these incredible stories. People want to hear more stories, I think. And we talked about having you come back to do a presentation on Driven Out, the forgotten war against Chinese Americans. And I think that will be maybe the next thing that we get to do together in the very near future, if you're interested.
Oh, it would be an honor to come back. And it's so amazing to be at the Book Club of California and to be speaking to your members. And maybe next time we'll try and do it live.
Yeah, that would be great. Once we're back open for in person, you'll be familiar with the digs. So
I know just where to come. I'm sitting, folks, I'm sitting at Kevin's desk here. And it's the seat I can't fill.
Well, thank you again, Jean. This was terrific. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us for this Book Club of California program this evening. Our next virtual program is next Monday, July 22nd at 5 o'clock. It's titled The Material Culture of Advertising, Treasures from the Winterthur Library's Collection of Trade Literature. A very bookish and collecting topic. Our speaker is Alexandra Alves. She's a book historian and curator from Special Collections at the Winterthur Museum, Garden and Library. So join us next week at 5 o'clock for this great lecture. You can register for that event online at bccbooks.org/programs. You can register for any of our events there. Again, bccbooks.org/programs, or use the link in the email that you're probably getting from the book club with our calendar of events. So thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be well and take care of yourself. And we hope to see you here at the book club soon. Thank you, everyone. Good night.